the laws of the United States and the programs government-sponsored concerning the use of addictive drugs are a total failure. Not only a total failure, but they're making the problem worse. They are so stupid that anyone supporting those laws must be either a moron or involved in the racket. It's that bad. First of all, we all know that government agencies are self-serving institutions. Let's face it. A person in a government agency wants to keep a job. So we'll consider the Bureau of Narcotics. It is in the interest of that bureau that there be a drug problem, because if there weren't, the bureau would have no reason for existence. And this is true of police matters on a much broader scale, because the drug problem is a subdivision of what we will call sumptuary laws. A sumptuary law is a confusion of church and state. It is a law against sin as distinct from crime. In my definition, although these definitions can always be disputed on, as it were, on the edges, a crime is an offense against society in which somebody is injured and is disposed to complain. A person who is robbed, assaulted, simply doesn't want that to happen. But there are innumerable sins, you might call them, because that's an ecclesiastical term, or we might say crimes without victims, such as gambling, prostitution, drug-taking, and various forms of sexual relationship. And when you try to regulate these things by law, you invariably enter into a super-colossal mess. Not only is it that government agencies against these things, we'll say narcotics squads, vice squads, and so on, have a vested interest in their continuance. But also by prohibiting them, you put up the price of engaging in them. Take heroin. The price of heroin, and bad heroin at that, is colossal. It needs $25 a day to maintain the habit. Therefore, this is one of the most thriving industries in the United States. I have been told that dollar-wise, heroin is the biggest import of the United States. I don't know if this is true. But somebody is doing very well indeed, I hope. The perfect sell. Get the person hooked, and in order to maintain their habit, they have to become a pusher. Sell it, or else a robber. And street crime, mugging, is directly related to the necessity of maintaining the heroin habit. Now, once you make this a matter for police control, you corrupt the police. The police in the United States began to be corrupted at the time of Prohibition. And Mr. Anslinger, who had a job under Prohibition, had to find himself another job. So he selected drugs as the new prohibition and did very well. He persuaded, by the force of the United States, its prestige, almost all other countries to cooperate in his program, and therefore set up by response, by bounce, the biggest international racket going. One wonders sometimes that Mr. Anslinger didn't profit from it. We can only say that he profited by holding this eminent position. But somebody is making fortunes out of the trade, simply because the price is high, and the price is high because it's forbidden. Any idiot should be able to see that. In the meantime, the police are neglecting their other duties. If you have a robbery, say, in your home, they couldn't be less interested in retrieving the stolen goods. I know a case that happened fairly recently where the police inspectors didn't come around for 2 days after the robbery. And then they sent over a couple of goons in plain clothes. Real goons. And, they sort of shuffled around and looked at things and went off. They don't give a damn. Because they've got too much to do. And they're underpaid. So my proposal is in general that the duties of police be restricted to 4 areas. 1, protecting us from robbery. 2, protecting us from violence. 3, directing traffic. And 4, giving aid to persons in distress. The personnel of vice squads and narcotic squads could simply be transferred to these other duties. Because in all conscience, there's enough to do in those 4 areas. Then you say, well, what are you going to do about these other things? Well, let's face it, let's be realistic. There are going to be people, there always have been people, who do silly things. It's stupid to become dependent on drugs. It's pretty stupid to gamble. But you can't stop people being stupid by law. Nor can you make people moral by law. It's the essence of Christian ideas that morality is of no significance unless whatever is done or whatever is not done is done freely. In other words, it has to be your own voluntary act. A person who is compelled to be moral is not, in Christian view, moral at all, but merely scared. And therefore, we would immensely relieve some of our social problems if we took all sumptuary laws off the books. Legitimize prostitution, gambling, and treat drug taking as a health problem. I think things like marijuana, which are relatively harmless, should be available on the same basis as alcohol. Licensed, not sold to minors, what have you. As to harder drugs, I think this is a problem for physicians and health clinics, not police. Definitely not police. So, in that case, what would happen? There would be at least a temporary rise, perhaps, in the use of these things. But freedom necessarily involves risk. You cannot have a free country which is at the same time a nursery. Now here's the FDA about to prohibit the sale of vitamins above a certain strength except on prescription. What are they going to interfere with next? As an adult male who has a fair knowledge of these things, I feel insulted by the making of these recommendations into law. I feel grateful to the FDA if it confines itself to giving advice. But when laws are passed so that I can't buy what vitamins I want to buy without a doctor's prescription, I feel offended. I feel that my intellect and judgment are insulted. So I'm perfectly willing to read the books and find out what's dangerous and what isn't, or what somebody's opinion is about what's dangerous and what isn't. Because medicine is not an exact science by a long shot. But when more and more laws are passed, the situation becomes intolerable. See, we have a very naive faith in law. Everybody says there ought to be a law against it. So they make a law against it. That makes everything more complicated. Because you can hardly move today without a lawyer to tell you what you may or may not do. It's especially in business, and especially in small business. So we are surrounded with law and surrounded with officers and officials who are acting supposedly for our own good, but actually acting for their own good, because it's their job. Now, if we took sumptuary laws off the books, we would empty the jails by at least a third of their population. The jails are jam full of people who ought not to be in jail at all, because they're in there for sin as distinct from crime. And they don't feel guilty, and therefore they resent being imprisoned. And the state of imprisonment merely confirms them in their hatred of society. In California, we're supposed to have the very best jails in the country. Places like Vacaville and San Quentin are supposed to be real far out. They are unbelievably dreadful, because they're a Kafkaesque situation with people in there on 1 to 10-year sentences. And you know we'll let you out if you show signs of improvement. And nobody knows what they're supposed to do. What is showing a sign of improvement? And will the probation officers consider that I'm merely showing signs of improvement as a pretense in order to get out, so that I can recommence a life of crime? And these then psychiatrists and probation officers have very subjective judgments about whether the person is faking or not. So these inmates are in the frightful position of total uncertainty as to how long they will be in there. Don't forget, too, that in the United States, prison means a lot more than being out of harm's way so that you won't harm society. It means sexual deprivation. It means the lousiest diet imaginable. And it is, all penologists pretty much agree that our prisons are schools for crime and sodomy. So when you put the rather sensitive people who tend to become addicts in these institutions, you create an abomination. There's no answer, and it merely increases the enemies of society. So we have to be rather cynical about these things and see and realize that various institutions do not exist for the good of the public, but for their own interests, and that when you prohibit something by law, you automatically sweep it under the carpet or drive it underground, where it festers and gets worse and worse and worse. Everything needs to be brought out into the open to have the sunlight on it. It's like, for example, the city streets, the primitive kind of city street where all sorts of little shops along it, and where mamas are sitting looking out of the window or sitting in chairs on the doorway and watch the passing crowd. There's far less likely to be crime in those streets than there is in the corridors of a housing development. Those long, long, empty corridors with nobody watching. Empty streets in nice residential apartment areas where nobody has a shop. That's the ideal situation for crime. That's why I say bring everything out into the open. Let everybody watch. And then you automatically reduce crime.